Welcome to Chandwell. My name's Michael, and as well as my model of a run-down West Yorkshire town set in 1993, I'm making an N-scale model of Bradford Cathedral. I've finished the magnificent bell tower, and in this video I'm going to talk about how I went about it and some of the challenges I faced, and how, hopefully, I overcame some of them. I'm joined by the Cathedral's Director of Education and Visitors, Maggie Myers, who will take us on a tour up the real tower and share some of its remarkable history as we go. In the last video, I showed how I started by printing sheets of paper on my inkjet printer. I explained why I chose to make it from a series of boxes. And I showed how I started with the foundations, a very important aspect of the tower. Let's join Maggie at the bottom of the tower and find out a little bit about it.
So the nave is completed in 1458, and 50 years later the tower is finished and put on the end, and it's believed that the tower was built as a freestanding structure and sort of plonked on the end and then attached to the rest of the church by means of an extra bay on the nave. So when they came to do the extensions in the 1950s and the 1960s, the first bits of the extensions were the office just behind me here and the song room extension here. And when they came to excavate and to build, put in the foundations for the song room, which was started first, they found that there weren't foundations for the tower. So they've actually built the song room and the office to support the tower and to kind of firm up those foundations.
With the foundations in place, I showed last time how I made the door.
Quite unusual for a small church of this size to have had a big west entrance as we have.
And I showed how I spent hours cutting out the components that made up the beautiful west window.
Above the west door is the beautiful west window, and all of our glass in here was plain glass until Victorian times, and this was the second window here, the west window, to go in 1864, and it's an absolutely beautiful pre-Raphaelite window, and it's all women apart from Jesus and the angel Gabriel. It's women of the Bible, and it's all women, and it's got this beautiful purple and red combination of colours particularly, which is quite unusual. And all of the figures are in very natural poses with their hands sort of in movement, and pairs of figures looking over shoulders, and it's a really truly pre-Raphaelite window. It's beautiful. You'll have to come and see it.
One of the most striking parts of the tower are its buttresses, which go all the way from the bottom to the top, getting progressively shallower as they go. I made these from a stack of cut 1mm card to get them to the correct thickness. Then I covered them with scale scenes texture to make them look like solid stone. I realised that it was difficult to get the buttress to join the tower without leaving the tiniest of gaps down the join. I realised that it was easier to put the buttress to the tower before adding the texture, and that way the texture can cover up the gaps. And there's a good example of this coming up. It did make it a little bit longer to complete, but I'm pleased with the results. With the window in place, it was time to top it off with the lid that makes up the string course along the top of its section of wall. I cut two shapes from 0.5mm card, one slightly larger than the other, and glued them on top of each other. This gives a lovely stepped appearance to the string course. But when I put it on top of the tower, it didn't fit. The natural unevenness and the imperfection of my construction has made none of the 8 buttresses be in exactly the right place. It's 0.5mm out here and there, and some are ever so slightly out of 90 degrees true. Whilst I rethink my approach, let's see how Maggie's getting on with her ascent of the tower.
So here we are, we've climbed halfway up the stairs-ish. We're on a level with the clock face, and I am standing outside the ringing room doorway. And you'll see above my head, there is a date on the stone above my head of 1268. So this is obviously a stone from probably the older church, the stone church that was here before this one, that was knocked down and burnt down by Scottish raiders in the early 1300s.
I carefully measured as much of the completed model as I could and noted this down. I then took a photo from above and scaled this to the right size in Inkscape. I could then adjust the shape to the exact perimeter of the real thing. This cut-out shape looked a bit wonky, but it did go on top with perfection. Before we move on to the clock, let's hear from Maggie about what it is that's behind the clock, the ringing room.
So I've just come through the doorway with the date above the door, and I'm standing in the ringing room. The bell ringers came up here in about 1864. Before this was the ringing room, this was the clockworks room. So a bit like the bells, the first bells went in the parish church, now the cathedral, in around sort of 1666. And that was also the time that the first public clock in Bradford went onto the side of the cathedral. And in those early days, late 1600s, 1700s, it took up a whole room's worth of space. Nowadays, our clock is just in a corner there. It doesn't have very much room. And so this was felt in the 1860s to be a place where the bell ringers could come. Before that, the bell ringers were sort of halfway up the west window on a sort of a midway floor there, and then they brought them up here. And since then, this has been the ringing room. And this is where the bell ropes for the 12 bells are. When they started out in the 1660s, it was kind of 4 and then 6 and then 8. And now we've got 12 bells. So this is where the magical bell ringing music happens. Not very often, but this is where it happens.
I drew the clock face in Inkscape and tried to make it as accurate as possible from photographs. There's an odd thing that I noticed about the clock, and that's the number 4. Most clocks that use Roman numerals on their faces use I for the number 4, but this one in Bradford uses IV, which I've not seen very often. One thing that I love about the clock face is that it is painted directly onto the stonework. It was last painted 34 years ago, and since then it has begun to fade. I used my usual ghost sign technique in Inkscape to apply a similar effect. I've not gone for complete accuracy here, but rather an impression of the fading nature of the clock. It wasn't until I'd assembled the section and added the first buttress that I realised that I'd forgotten to make the end of the hour hand blue. So I reprinted and reassembled the section. I yanked the buttress off and reused it. It turns out that this was wasted effort, as I later decided to cut the clock hands out myself as separate components. It was fiddly work with the scalpel, but the result was passable. I used watercolour paint to take away the paper's white edge, and then I glued the minute hand on top of the hour hand to give a proper 3D look. The time, 11:41, is the same as every other clock in Chandwell. The result is very subtle, but it does have a proper 3D look as you view the tower. The cathedral's crest has a woolsack on it, and one of my favourite stories about the cathedral is how that came to be. I asked Maggie to tell us the story.
It's something that happened during the English Civil War, 1642 to 1645. Bradford was on the parliamentarian side during the English Civil War, and on at least 5 occasions there were skirmishes in and around this building. There were a couple of times where royalist troops were just down at the other end, where the extension is now. And so they had their cannons, and their intention was to knock down the tower to teach the people of Bradford a lesson. The people of Bradford not having cannons, not having a great deal, not having many guns, what did they have? They had wool, because they were sheep farmers. And so the people of Bradford filled sacks of wool, the story goes, took them up to the top of the tower, and then tied those wool sacks around the outside of the tower, so that when the cannons fired their cannonballs, the cannonballs just bounced off the tower, and that saved the parish church, saved what is now the cathedral. And for that reason, that's why we have the wool sack on our badge. It's a great story, and it's a story that we tell to all the children that come here. So it really links us to Bradford's kind of wool past, but also we've got our own wool story. It's a cracking story.
The louvers are bevelled inwards and have stone tracery like the windows, so I used the same technique as I showed in my previous videos. Each wall is made from 3 sheets of 0.5mm card, with the openings each slightly bigger than the ones below. The tracery was made in the same way, using 3 layers of thin card. And then small rectangles of card make up the stonework vents. Here's a painted one, which starts off like this. The process of adding these rectangles was painstakingly slow. They were cut to just the right size to be able to hold themselves in place whilst the glue set. But arranging them in the first place was a tricky job. This column of 5 took about 4 minutes. There are 16 columns, so that's about an hour spent arranging tiny rectangles in tiny slots. The things we do. Anyway, I painted them a dark stone colour, and then I lightly brushed a lighter tone on top. The end result is quite effective. They're a bit wonky in places, but then the real things are also a bit wonky, so I think that's fine. I shared the gluing of it into position as part of one of my weekly updates for my channel members. Hello channel members, and welcome to Chandwell's members update for Sunday the 24th of November. It's taken me 8 or 9 hours to get this done, but it's actually done and they've turned out far better than I could have hoped. So I've just applied the glue and I am going to stick this on top right now, and this will become part of the video about the tower, I think. So I'm just going to drop that on there like that, and then whilst holding it with my left hand I'm just going to move it into place. So that is about right. I think that is looking fantastic. Obviously when the top is on it will be dark inside. I'm not sure whether to leave it so you can see through. The string courses in this part of the tower don't go horizontally like they do elsewhere. This one here just goes around the buttress only and not across the face of the tower. And this one, it goes across the buttresses and then it peaks up and over the tops of the louvers, so I couldn't just put a lid on like I'd done with all the rest. I made shapes for the buttresses and dropped them into place like this. As I was cutting out the 40 pieces of card for the next parts of the buttresses, I was thinking about the stonemasons all those years ago, cutting out their pieces of stone, and what Maggie had told me about their marks in the cathedral.
In the tower area of the cathedral is a really good place to see stonemasons' marks, and there are 60 different designs that they've covered both on the inside and the outside of the tower when they've done an archaeological survey, and they've recorded all the different marks, and they found 60 different designs, 50 of which designs are in the tower area alone. But it's a great place to go stonemason mark hunting in this area.
So the tiny bits of 1mm card get glued into stacks and pressed into place on the tower. I never managed to get these little stacks absolutely perfect. There's always a gap of a few tenths of a millimetre or so here and there. But by gluing it upright and forgetting about the gap, I'm able to get it about right before putting the texture on. With the glue set, the texture can go next and easily covers up the gaps in the base layers. At this point, and with hours of buttress making behind me, I realised that I'd got it wrong on these top two sections. I didn't spot it until now, but when I'd adjusted the drawing of the top of the tower months ago, I did not lower the corresponding buttress drawing. So it was up too high, and none of the string courses were in the right place, and the buttress would overshoot the top. I needed to carefully remove them all again. A sharp scalpel helped ensure that I didn't cut into the stonework that I wanted to keep. They came off cleanly enough. A watercolour pencil helped touch up the edges. The tiny tops were fiddly to make, but they went on in exactly the right way. These tiny pieces of texture paper are only a couple of millimetres tall. So, I'm almost at the top. Is Maggie?
So here we are at the top of the tower that was completed in 1508. And this is of course where, during the English Civil War, during the battles of the steeple, when the woolsacks were hung over the cathedral tower to protect it, this was the place where the woolsack were hung up with the cords, the ropes, and then hung over the tower. And this is where the royalist troops were aiming at to shoot those cords of the ropes to knock those woolsacks down. History.
Thanks, Maggie. The detail at the top was cut from texture paper stuck into 2 layers, and carefully cut with a scalpel to reveal the small arches. These are then stuck in layers to give some 3D relief. It's important with this technique to colour the white edges of the paper a stone colour to ensure that it all blends in nicely. What else is up the top, Maggie?
From up here, as you look round on the 4 sides, you can see so many different views of Bradford out towards the moor, probably the most unchanged down that way. And behind me, lots and lots of aspects of particularly Victorian Bradford, the Midland Hotel and other Victorian buildings in the centre of Bradford. And you can probably also see from this shot and other shots that Phil will give, the buttresses and the pinnacles, some of which are really, really eroded and some of which have been replaced over the years with a more modern one that will be there to last hopefully for hundreds and hundreds of years. So you can see the effects of the weather and erosion from the blackened Bradford of former times as well.
There were a couple of things that struck me when I saw that video of Maggie on top of the tower. The first is I've made the parapet wall far too thick, but I've decided to live with that one. I'm not going to redo the whole top just for that. And the second one was just how huge those pinnacles were. Absolutely enormous. They're about 2 meters tall, and I struggled to work out how I'd go about making them. When I mentioned it in my last video, a few viewers suggested that I use interdental toothbrushes, and I can understand why. So I bought a few and did some experiments, but it didn't really work out. I also tried the end of a wooden skewer, and a couple of different approaches involving sticking track ballast to skewers with glue. But they all looked a bit rubbish. In the end, I decided to stack tiny squares of card. I printed them in my usual way and stuck them to 1mm and 0.5mm card. And then I stacked them on top of each other using PVA glue. The larger ones could be put in place with tweezers, or the tip of a scalpel. The smaller ones, this one isn't even the smallest but is only 1.2mm on each side, needed to be put in place on the tip of a pin. They're not perfect and I may replace them in future, but they're good enough for now. I'm resisting 3D printing as I want to see what is possible using only card and my scalpel. It's not high fidelity, but I certainly believe that it has charm and atmosphere. I finished off the model by adding the string courses and stone detail around the window and door. I added an estimation of what the roof looks like. Bradford Cathedral is a spectacular building and its model is going to comprise 23 different parts. I've now done the first 2. It's due to be unveiled in the cathedral in September 2025, and although I'm making really good progress, I'm about 2 months behind where I want to be. I'm going to move on to the lantern tower next, which shouldn't be as complex as the tower that I've just done. I think the hardest parts are behind me now. So watch out for that in the coming weeks. My next video, however, is going to be a scale scenes special where I celebrate the kits of scale scenes that have taught me everything that I know and still use for all of my textures on my buildings. And we'll hear from Mr. Scale Scenes himself, John Whiffen. If you're interested in the overall layout and plan for the cathedral, then this video here will give you all the details you need. Until then, thank you for watching this video, take care, and I'll see you next time.